Make their way downstairs. Welcome back for another look at the kings of ancient Israel. Last week we did Saul, talked about Saul and Samuel. This week we're going to listen to Professor Levine talk about David. I want to say just a little bit about her lecture. She talks a little bit about David and gives you a little bit of background on David and talks a little bit about his character. And she emphasizes a couple of things. She emphasizes the covenant that God makes with David. That is the fact that God promises David that his line will rule over Israel after David. And then she also emphasizes David's, let's say, humanity, and that is that he's not perfect. As a matter of fact, he sins quite a bit against God, and she focuses particularly upon his relationship with Bathsheba. And you probably all know the story. They enter into adultery, and she spends a lot of time talking about this. And not to make David look bad, but what she's trying to do, I think, is to explain why things go so wrong towards the end of David's reign. Because David has been chosen by God to rule over the Israelites, and yet towards the end of David's reign, his sons turn against him. There's a huge rebellion, and it looks as though the wheels are coming off. And this needs to be explained. Why? If David has been chosen by God. And she traces a lot of this back to Bathsheba. The other reason she emphasizes Bathsheba is because from this union between David and Bathsheba, King Solomon will be born. And so this gives us a sense of continuity here at the same time. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll watch listen to her lecture, and then I think we should have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And be able to answer any questions that you might have here. So let's go ahead and do this. Maybe not. Let me push this one and see what happens over here. Okay. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you this much. Good. With the introduction of David, soon to become king in Israel, the Deuteronomic historian provides us a hint of prosperity to come, tribal unification, the royal grant covenant finally put into play, and Israel, after all those disasters in the period of Judges and the difficulties between Samuel and Saul, will finally have a time of fulfillment of those promises made to the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Indeed, David captures the imagination so much, I suggest he's actually worthy of a course in and of himself. How best then to look at King David, this magnificent hero, this charmer, this rogue, this scoundrel? Let's take a quick look at some of the various characterizations by which the Deuteronomic historian portrays David. And then what I'd like to do is look very, very closely at one particular scene, the very well-known story of David and Bathsheba, because in this one story, one finds an epitome of everything that makes David so compelling. His charm, his fidelity, his conniving, his trickery, and ultimately his piety to God and God's love for him, but also God's refusal to let him get away with murder and with apostasy. So here we go with the story of King David. In effect, who is he? He begins as an erstwhile shepherd, the youngest son of a man named Jesse, who's called to the royal court to soothe King Saul's spirit when Saul's spirit is troubling him. In this sense, he's also the psalmist, whose hymns to God reach the heights of poetic artistry. And when one looks through the Psalms, one finds numerous of these songs ascribed to King David. Could he have actually written them? If there were a King David, it's possible. He's also the king's armor bearer. He is a warrior. But in this wonderful story, the stuff of legend, I fear, we're told that he eschews Saul's armor. It's simply too big for him, and he will go up against the Philistine champion Goliath of Gath with only a slingshot. And with that slingshot, he brings down the giant and thereby the Philistine forces. He's also the enemy of King Saul, the reigning monarch. David is fighting for his own throne. He wants to take over, and he will do so with the aid of Saul's daughter Michal, who loves him. We're never told he loves her. And Saul's son Jonathan. He's the roguish leader of a gang of malcontents. He's a political opportunist who usurps Israel's throne, and in order to do so actually becomes a Philistine vassal for a while. David will take help from anywhere he can get it. But he's also a king granted a royal eternal covenant by God, indeed adopted by God. And he's an adulterer who arranges the death of his adulterous partner's husband. He's a parent who allows one of his children to rape another and does nothing about it. And he's a parent who watches yet another son engage in a civil war against him. This is a son David actually loves, Absalom. Finally, he's an old man, bedridden, unable to rule, who cannot find warmth. These roles and more contribute, in fact, to the scholarly quest of David. So we must raise the question, is David a real person? It would be lovely if archaeological investigation around Jerusalem from the period circa 1000 BCE before the Common Era, when we normally date David, showed the great city of Jerusalem. But it doesn't. It would be lovely if we had external sources, archaeological, inscriptional, epigraphic, attesting to David's evidence. But we don't. Some biblical scholars say, no, David ever existed. He's much like King Arthur, the stuff of legends, inventions passed down from parent to child, glorified here, ambivalent here, always developed, always ongoing. If there is a real King David, and frankly, I want there to be somebody who's this rich, there's no way we're ever going to get back to him. There's no way we can penetrate back behind the legends. All we can do at this point, until archaeology discovers something new, is look at the story. One final point on archaeology. Some archaeologists have claimed to have discovered an inscription on a potsherd entitled or read House of David, Beit David. And by this they attest, because the potsherd seems to date from the right time period, aha, we have evidence of King David, House of David. The problem is, the date of the shard is not entirely clear, and the meaning of the inscription itself is also not entirely clear. Archaeology is sometimes much a discipline of believing rather than actually scientifically proving. If one wants to believe this is testimony to David, by all means. But the proof is not yet finally in. We also have a problem with the historicity of David, at least of some of his stories, when we look to the Bible itself. One of the best-known stories, we've already mentioned it, is the death of Goliath, the Philistine giant, the Philistine hero. The problem is, when we look at the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 21, verse 19, we also find a reference to the death of Goliath, except this death is attributed to David's soldier, one Elkanah. Did David kill Goliath? I suspect not. It's part of the stuff of legendary development that major stories accrue to heroes. Here's a major story of the death of a particular figure. The person who killed him, this Elkanah, is not well known. Said the later legendary developers, we'll give that one to David too. We actually find similar stories in United States history. Did George Washington do everything we actually think he did? Actually, no, sometimes some of those things were done by his generals. Did the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower do everything we attribute to them? No, in fact, they didn't. Much is the stuff of later legendary development. And so I fear it is with David. We can even see the development of David's legends when we look to later sources in the Bible. Not only are the records in the books of Samuel material of legend, but the legend continues. When we look, for example, at the books of Chronicles, which are basically post-exilic, much later replays of the Deuteronomic history, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, we do find references to David. But when we go to 1 Chronicles chapter 20, we find that 1 Chronicles will tell us the story of 2 Samuel chapter 11 about the siege of the Ammonites at Rabbah and the defeat of the Ammonite king. Left out is what happens in between. That's the story of David and Bathsheba. the chronicler simply bypasses it. Here, David's reputation will not be sullied at all. Indeed, whitewashing political peccadillos is not a modern invention. The chronicler does it before the Common Era. It's also, I think, to be expected that David's story would be developed by southern scribes, those people down in Judah, in Jerusalem, who believe that their city, Jerusalem, their kingdom, Judah, is there by divine right. And they believe it in part because of this royal grant which they claim David to have received. As we'll see later when we get to the prophetic text, people like Isaiah and Jeremiah have a very difficult time convincing the population of Judea and Jerusalem that their kingdoms actually are in danger. They're convinced God will protect them because God's under contract. David is therefore very, very important for people in the south. Where does this idea come from? 2 Samuel chapter 7. Spoken to David by the court prophet Nathan, we find God's words. When your days are complete and you lie with your fathers, I will raise up your seed, your posterity. I will make his throne secure forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he errs, I will chastise him with the rod of people and the lashes of men. But my steadfast love, my chesed, my deep abiding love, I will not remove from him. Your house and your kingship shall be secure before me forever, and your throne will be established permanently. And not only do we find this from the pen of the Deuteronomic historian, we also find it in the Psalms. Psalm 89, the poet Ethan the Ezrahite exults that God has promised, quote, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to my servant David, I will establish your descendants forever and build your throne for all generations. You can see with material like this why David is so important to Israelite history. Now, let's look closely at one of these stories of David. Although David is exceptionally important, although he has a royal grant, although he is God's beloved, that does not make him a perfect person. Consistent with the way the ancient Hebrews and Israelites told their stories, their heroes are shown, pardon the cliche, warts and all. That's what in fact makes them human. That's, I think in part, what makes them so compelling as literary figures. Our test case here is David and Bathsheba, and as we go on, you might think to yourselves, do I still like David? Do I want him to win? Does he somehow retain my affection? What do I want to happen to him? 2 Samuel chapter 11. One other point. There's no way we can look at this story without bringing to bear on it our own cultural concerns. I have difficulty looking at some of these biblical stories without thinking about movies. I can't think about King David without thinking about Gregory Peck, and Bathsheba will always be Susan Hayward. But the movies always add on to the text material that the text itself does not say. If you know these films, if you know the stories from popular culture, see if you can bracket them from your mind and just follow along in the text. Here's the opening verse. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his officers and all Israel with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites. So far, so good. But David remained in Jerusalem. Already the narrator is cueing us in that something has gone wrong. David is not doing what he is supposed to do. If this is the time when all kings go to battle and David is a king, he should not be home, he should be out at the front. That's where kings belong. David's deficiencies are beginning to show. And not merely has he removed himself from battle, he sent his soldiers out there. People will die on his behalf. The least he could do is put in an appearance in the field, and he will not do that. And I suspect that this failure right in the first verse simply foreshadows the increasing failures. First, David fails on the political front. He fails to become the general he is, to be the king that he is, and lead his troops. We'll see subsequent failures in his monarchy simply as we go along in the story, which continues. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. This is David, that skilled musician, that man of valor, that warrior, sensible of speech and handsome in appearance. whom the Lord favors. This is David, our hero, who's taking a nap late one afternoon, rising from his couch while his troops are in the field. What sort of warrior is this? And what did this woman he sees, this luscious Bathsheba in her bath? Bathsheba really doesn't mean bath. Bath is really the Hebrew bat, daughter of Sheba. Interpreters frequently question Bathsheba's complicity in her relationship with David. Does she know he's there? If you see the movie, Susan Hayward knows exactly what she's doing. But Bathsheba, the character, I don't know. Does she know that the king hasn't gone to the front? Does she know that he normally walks on his roof at this time of day? Is her bath time a convenience? Had she planned to be seen? Does she know he sees her? And whatever we answer to any of these questions, all of which are legitimate, whatever our answers will be, those answers will influence how we interpret the rest of the story and how we interpret Bathsheba. Because once again, the woman's motives are never given. Now, David's relationship with Bathsheba is no simple spur-of-the-moment lust. He's got to plan this out. It's premeditated. Next verse. David sent for messengers and inquired and said, "Isn't this Bathsheba the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" One translation. Another one reads, "It was reported this is Bathsheba the wife of Uriah the Hittite." The ambiguity is telling. Does David actually know who she is, or does he have to find out? And if he does know, how long has he had his eye on her? Readers familiar with the David story to this point might recollect his other relationships with women, because David has been around the block a time or two. For example, he marries the very, very clever Abigail after being, I think, complicit in causing the death of Abigail's husband. A woman's marital state will not stand in David's way if she can provide him something that he wants or something that he needs. And indeed, by marrying Abigail, the story is in 1 Samuel chapter 25, David is able to consolidate his base with the Calebite tribes. So marrying Abigail functions in terms of political opportunity. But here with Bathsheba, there's no political opportunity. This is simply lust. In terms of political opportunity, one could also note how David can manipulate women throughout his life. Michal, Saul's daughter, loves David. It's not clear David ever loves her, but he uses her in as a pawn. And finally, after years of being used by David, Michal finally turns against him. We find this in 2 Samuel 6. This is David bringing the ark of the Lord to Jerusalem. As the ark came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, the narrator wants to tell us exactly who she is, right? Looked out the window, like Sisera's mother, the woman in the window, and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So she comes to David and she berates him for uncovering himself before the eyes of maids and servants, as she puts it, as any vulgar fellow might uncover himself. And David retorts to her, "It was the Lord who made me king over your father Saul." And then we're told, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death. This is narrative artistry. Did she have no child because God condemned her to barrenness because of her berating of God's beloved David? Or did she have no child because David refused again to come into her bed? And if that's the case, why? Because he hated her? Or because he was afraid that if she had a child, that child would also be Saul's heir, and that child eventually would raise up an army against David? Narrative artistry all the way through. In fact, whether David can actually love or not, I think remains an open question. We know people love David, but it's not clear David loves anyone. The only time David actually seems to show love is his public lament over Jonathan's dead body. He says, "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love was wonderful, passing the love of women." But it's easy for David to say that then. Jonathan is dead. Saul is dead. David knows his throne is secure. Indeed, he even orders that this song be taught to the people of Judah. But does he actually love Jonathan? Or is this simply political opportunism? Jonathan's love was passing the love of women. Jonathan is dead. I see David as opportunist. You all can make up your own mind. Moving back to the story of Bathsheba. David sent messages to get her. Here's the line. She came to him, he laid with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. All this great romance, wine, flowers, champagne, a bath, nothing. She came to him, he lay with her. Boom. This verse is loaded with questions. Did David abuse his power? If somebody sends soldiers to your house, the king's messengers, and says the king wants to see you, it's very difficult to say no. This is a royal summons. Is this a rape? Had Bathsheba any choice? The king wants you. What are you going to do? Say no. Did David recognize by his actions that he's committing adultery? We might look to something like, Deuteronomy chapter 22, which says both the man and the woman who in town commit adultery should be put to death. Does he care that he's making Bathsheba an adulteress? In turn, what about Bathsheba? Could she have said no? Could she have said, I will come tomorrow? Was she expecting the invitation, thinking, finally I've gotten what I wanted, I've tracked him, and he's risen to my bait? And what if the notice that she came to him, not that they took her? Is this simply an expression, or is there willingness involved? And what about the statement she was purifying herself? It's true, according to the Levitical law codes, after a woman is done with her menstrual cycle, she is supposed to bathe, ritual immersion, and that puts her back in a state of purity, which means she can then have sexual intercourse without being in a state of impurity. Are we told this to be told that Bathsheba is faithful to the laws of God? Or are we being told this to let us know on the more biological level? Here is a woman who is not pregnant. And therefore we know that when Bathsheba conceives, the child is not her husband Uriah's, the child is King David's. Well, the great romance of Hollywood legend is simply one verse. He lay with her, she returned to her house. But then events move very quickly. The next verse, the woman conceived and she sent to David, and she told him, I am pregnant. But my question is, what does she want David to do? Right? It's clearly David's child. He admits that. But what should he do? Does she want him to pray to God that she miscarried so the evidence will be wiped away? Does she want him to procure for her an abortion? Might he know someone who can do this? Does she want him to recall her husband from the front to cover up the adultery, get Uriah home and into her bed quickly? Does she want David to kill her husband and marry her himself so that she could give birth to a child who might at some point be the royal heir? All we know is she tells him she is pregnant and that he needs to do something. And questions continue to abound. From coveting his neighbor's wife to adultery, David will next turn to murder. The king recalls Bathsheba's husband from the front. His name is Uriah. He is identified as a Hittite. Therefore, he's not an Israelite. He's a mercenary. He's a soldier for hire working on behalf of King David. David recalls Uriah, and after meeting with him, encourages him, quote, go down to your house and wash your feet. This is not simply an invitation to clean up. This is an invitation to connubiality, because feet in biblical Hebrew, raglayim, is a euphemism for genitals. David is simply saying, go home and sleep with your wife. You're back from the front, take leave. Uriah actually knows what David is asking. And he, the Hittite, the non-Israelite, responds finally with fidelity. He says to David, the ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths. They're in tents in the encampment. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? He knows exactly what David wants. But he goes on, as you live and your soul lives, I shall not do such a thing. There's loyalty. The next night, David gets Uriah drunk, hoping to send him home. And Uriah grabs a blanket and sleeps with the soldiers at the door of the king's house. He still demurs. And finally, David, knowing he's not going to get Uriah home, sends him back with a sealed letter to Joab, the general, saying, place Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. Now, the plot is very clear here. We know what David wants ultimately to happen. But why exactly did David want Uriah to go home? Now, most of the time when people think about this, the answer seems obvious. Go home so Uriah can sleep with his wife, and thereby everyone can pass off the baby as Uriah's. David's not going to tell anybody. Bathsheba's not going to tell anybody. And Uriah will never know the difference. That's possible. But there are other possibilities as well. And I think we tend not to think about them because we want David to be the good guy, and that's the most benign of all chances, right? Might he have wanted Uriah to discover that Bathsheba was pregnant and kill her? Solves David's problem. Might he have wanted Uriah to find Bathsheba pregnant and agree to divorce her? Again, it solves David's problem. Might he have wanted Uriah to kill Bathsheba in a fit of jealousy? And again, David's problem is resolved. Or might he have wanted Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba and thereby violate the conventions of holy war? Because as we've seen, soldiers in holy war must keep themselves pure. They are not allowed to have intercourse with women. And what happens if they do? The idea would be God would strike them dead because they violated divine command. Or if their fellow soldiers found out about it, their fellow soldiers would have to remove that impurity from the camp, and the fellow soldiers would thereby kill him. And again, David is off. He is free. I don't know what his motives are. Some of them are more difficult to believe than others. And how indeed is Uriah to be assessed here? In the movies, Uriah is usually pretty awful. And there are some novels about David and Bathsheba in which Uriah is an abusive wife-beater, and David is simply the kind, gentle man who comes to the rescue and provides Bathsheba the love and the tenderness that she had never known. But that's not what we have in the Bible. That makes the story easier, but the Bible doesn't let us off the hook that easily. Do his fidelity and his innocence make David's decadence even more monstrous? Here the Hittite is the faithful one, David, God's beloved, the Israelite king, is not. Or should we conclude that he has no relationship with his wife whatsoever? Certainly he could have gone home and at least said, hello Bathsheba, how are you? Nothing required that he sleep with her. Why does he avoid her? Or is he so in love with her that he knew he could not resist the temptation? Because he knew the minute he set foot in that door, he would grab his beloved wife and kiss her, and before you know it, the conventions of holy war would be violated. Or does he respect Israel's Torah so much that he, a Hittite, is faithful to what God wants when God's beloved is not? And does he finally realize, after David keeps saying, go home, go home, go home, that his fate is sealed? Does he realize what David has done? Because adultery can never stay hidden. The news is going to get out. What exactly does Uriah know? And when he is handed this sealed letter, signing his death warrant, does he actually know that he is bringing that warrant to the commander and that he will die? And he dies bravely accepting his fate. Because what other choice did he have? Again, the text does not tell us, and this is what makes it so rich. I can picture people in the ancient world listening to this text and debating it. And it may be that the way we answer these questions tells us more about ourselves and our values than the text itself. The text raises the questions. The answers are ours to provide. Well, Bathsheba, after a time of mourning, marries David and bears him a son. But then we're told the thing David had done had displeased the Lord. We've already seen David mourning in public grief for Saul and Jonathan. Here again, I question the sincerity of that public grief, because I question David's sincerity about Bathsheba all the way through. She mourns. What about him? And by the way, as long as we're here, what about Bathsheba's mourning? Does she do it because it's the socially polite thing to do? If she didn't mourn her husband, people would talk. Or does she do it because she really loved him and now she knows her fate is doomed? Or did she do it because she thought, good riddance, and I've now got what I wanted, I'm going to marry the king and have his child? As for David, what do we do with him? He has gone from voyeurism to adultery, to possible rape, to murder, and then cover-up. And this is the man who has a royal grant. Where's God going to come in? The news of the adultery gets out. God speaks to David through the prophet Nathan, the same one who gave him the royal grant. And Nathan says to him, you have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you have taken his wife to be your wife. What offends God here is less the adultery than the murder. Right? You have struck down Uriah. Therefore the sword will never again depart from your house. I will take your wives from before your eyes and give them to your neighbor. Turns out that neighbor is David's son, Absalom. Nathan goes on, he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For what you did in secret, this I will do before all Israel. And during the civil war, David's son Absalom, who revolts against him, takes David's concubines up to the roof of the palace and sleeps with them in the sight of all Israel. Adultery is never private. It involves messengers, Nathan knows, and co-workers, and confidants, and it even affects one's children, because this adultery will lead to disasters in David's house. The rape of his daughter by his son, the murder of that son by another son, and defeat all around. David does admit his sin regarding Bathsheba, and Nathan tells him that at least this particular sin has been passed over in God's purview. We have Psalm 51, which is entitled, A Psalm of David, when the prophet Nathan came to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. But despite this repenting, Nathan tells him, the child that is born to you shall die. And as we know, older sons do not inherit. David and Bathsheba do have a second child who, with the machinations of his mother, Bathsheba, who discovers how to work the harem to her advantage, and the prophet Nathan, engineered to put on the throne. And this is Solomon. So thus at the end of her story, at least, Bathsheba makes her own fate, and Solomon will become the ideal and quite typical Near Eastern king, and so fulfill both the pro and the anti-monarchical predictions made back when by the prophet Samuel. And what happened to David regarding a woman will ultimately happen to Solomon, because we're told in 1 Kings, Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, and they led his heart astray after idols. We'll see this in the next lecture.
Too much.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah. Right off the bat, what sorts of questions do you have about that? It's not the King David you're used to, is it? I mean, that's for sure, because the King David.
Bible, you know all this.
Well, the King David that we tend to focus upon is the King David that is portrayed in the first half of 2 Samuel. That is where he becomes king and he's beloved by God. One of the reasons I like this is because she focuses upon, in a really textured way, his adultery with Bathsheba, which is integral to the story. And again, I think one of the things that the reason the story of Bathsheba is so important is because the Israelites have to make sense out of what happens to David in the second half of his reign. Why, if he's chosen by God and if he's beloved by God, why then is there civil war? Why does the son rise up and revolt against him and literally overpower him? And then why is that line then? Why does that line shift directly from Abigail and David to Bathsheba and David instead? And this is a very important part of the story of David, but we don't tend to focus upon that. But anyway, so questions that you might have. Yeah, Bob.
Well, I guess you sort of answered my question, which is, sort of why the Torah detail, associated with it, because, without that context, I'm just not quite sure sort of why I'm being told this.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what she's doing is she's doing an interlinear interpretation. I mean, she's reading a lot into it. Some of the, she's asking questions that I'm not sure that contemporaries would have asked of the text. She's wanting to know, what are David's motives here and what are Bathsheba's motives? And I'm not sure the contemporaries would have been interested in that. They're trying to make sense out of what happened in the second half of David's reign.
Yeah.
But she's bringing a 21st century sort of literary interpretation to the text.
And she's bringing a woman's perspective into it.
The idea, she asked the question, did David rape Bathsheba? I don't think contemporaries would have asked that because that would have meant that King Solomon then would have been illegitimate, right? They would have asked that question. Not at all. I think that's, again, that's a feminist interpretation that's going on right here. Any other questions that come to mind right off the bat?
Well, I felt like I was listening to the TV of today.
Well, you are very much so. Very much so.
Really?
Yeah.
She couldn't find one good thing about David.
Well, focusing on the second half of Solomon, she's.
Oh yeah.
That's what she's doing.
Sure.
The second half of Samuel. One of the things I think we do need to deal with is, she says she brought up the point that some scholars, biblical or otherwise, have questioned the very existence of King David. And we need to answer that. And it's, and she says, there's no direct evidence that we have that David actually existed. And I think it's like the black hole, that there was, for the longest time, there was no direct evidence that a black hole existed, but there was all sorts of collaboration and collateral evidence that a black hole existed, and finally they found black holes, right? And I think the same thing is true about King David. The very fact that there's no inscription or epigraphy monument that says, I, King David, created this, doesn't mean that there wasn't a King David. There's a lot of collateral evidence that leads to the idea that there was, in fact, a King David. One of the things we know is, and she said, the archaeological evidence around the city of Jerusalem around the year 1000 when David was king doesn't depict this huge flourishing city, but what it does depict is a heavily fortified city built upon Mount Zion, right? And this lends credence to the fact that some sort of warrior took over the city because it was pre-existing. There was a pre-existing city there, took it over, fortified it, and turned it into his capital, right? And this gives us evidence that someone of the stature of a warrior king did something like this, right? The other says, secondly, something else happens around this period, and that is around the year 1000, and that is that the 10 tribes of Israel become unified right around this period. And again, even if we don't have evidence, directly that is outside of Scripture saying that mighty King David unified the 10 tribes of Israel, there is in fact historical evidence that this took place, right? And again, it's sort of like the collateral evidence on the outside of a black hole saying, well, we don't have clear evidence that there's a black hole there, but we have collateral evidence. And I think the historical record testifies to this as well. Again, a third thing is right around the year 1000, one of the things we know is that the priestly shrine, the shrine at Shiloh, which up until this time had been the major point of worship of Yahweh, the artifacts of Shiloh are moved to Jerusalem, right? And Jerusalem then becomes the focal point for the worship of Yahweh right around this time. And what Scripture tells us is that David moved the Ark of the Covenant and he moved the other elements of that shrine from Shiloh down to Jerusalem. And so we have lots and lots of evidence there right around the periphery that there was something going on here which lends credence to the existence of David. And the final thing I will say about this is that Solomon is well documented, both inside as well as outside of Scripture. And Solomon, all of the evidence in Scripture talks about David as being Solomon's father, right? So there again, I think there's enough evidence, periphery evidence, that we don't have to worry about whether David actually existed or not. I mean, it seems pretty clear that he did. Okay, does that lead to any other questions? Yeah, please, Dick.
Yeah, Ron, what's the evidence of the Psalms being credited to David?
Oh, this is really interesting. If you read the Psalms, you will see that there are a number of different authors of the Psalms, and this comes all the way from the ancient Hebrews. That they will, in many cases, or just about all cases, they will tell you, the Psalms will tell you, this psalm was written by this person, or this psalm was written by this person, and for different reasons, right? And they will tell you why they were written as well. There are a number of psalms that are attributed to King David, and as Professor Levine said, if David existed, it's probably clear that he wrote a number of these psalms. And, the evidence seems to be there, right? But he certainly didn't write all of the psalms. There's no doubt about that. That's not in question. Yeah. What else? I made some notes right here. Let me see. We talked about this. Okay. She did mention one of the things she passed over just briefly is that things really that David's own household falls apart. And again, I think this is one of the reasons why the story of Bathsheba is there, to make sense out of why this household that he had established with Abigail. He has a number of sons and daughters. And his oldest son, Amnon, is the one who rapes one of his daughters, Tamar. And this causes huge fallout within the family among the other sons, to the point that Absalom, his not his oldest son, but I think it's his second oldest son, actually commits fratricide and kills all of his other brothers, including the one who raped his sister Tamar. And so again, there's this horrible falling out towards the end of David's reign that these people needed to make sense out of. But this also helps to explain then why should the Israelites accept Solomon, because David has legitimate sons, but they all die. They're all either murdered or die, right? And so the legitimacy then goes from David's direct line to his surviving son with Bathsheba. So there's a lot going on here in this story. I think, again, as you said, this is not the David that you know, but if you will read this, 2 Samuel, you will see, as a matter of fact, that what she's talking about is there. It's really there.
Sure.
We just don't tend to emphasize that. Yeah. Any other questions about this? I mean, it's kind of good to take this, non-traditional look at the text once again. That's why I like these people who aren't dyed-in-the-wool Christians or Lutherans or something like that to look at these texts, because they bring a different lens to it than we do, and it kind of makes you take a step back and say, wow, really? Well, I need to think about that, and I think it's useful to do that.
I never knew there was other documentation that David did not kill Goliath.
Well, that's interesting too, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah. And it's right there in 2 Samuel. Yeah, in 2 Samuel as well. But as she says, this is one of those things that probably accrued to him simply because he was a mighty warrior, right? And it's interesting, as a matter of fact, 2 Samuel also records that for a while he's battling Saul, maybe this isn't 1 Samuel, while he's battling Saul, he actually fights for the Philistines. Because Saul is trying to hunt him down, and he can only find refuge with the Philistines themselves, right? So he's a very textured individual, David is. You might want to just read 1 and 2 Samuel for your own to get this more textured appreciation for who David is. Yeah. But I would put your mind at ease. Your salvation doesn't depend on whether David slew Goliath or not.
No, but it does just shakes the foundation of things I was taught since I was a child.
Yeah. Those kinds of nuances. Yeah.
Well,
Yes, please.
So why is David there in the first place? What do we gain from having him in that story?
Oh, well, this is really interesting because it comes out of the Israelites trying to make sense out of You know, why, first of all, these two great kingdoms emerge, and that is the kingdom of David and then the kingdom of Solomon. Where do they come from? We came into Canaan as 10 distinct tribes, right? We're all Israelites. That is descendants of Jacob, right? Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and then his sons are going to be called Israelites. So we're all sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we were independent for a long time. We were ruled over by judges, but then for some reason we have abandoned that, and we came under kings. And then the major kingdom splits into two kingdoms. There's northern Israel, and then there's Judah. Where does this all come from? They're trying to make sense out of their history. And there has to be an explanation then why do we get our first king Saul, and this is what 1 Samuel talks about. And then where does the kingdom go from there? And you know, so we have the emergence then of the king and the beginnings of the kingdom of Israel under Saul, and then we have this flourishing larger kingdom under David, and then eventually under Solomon, this kingdom of the Israelites is literally going to go from the Red Sea all the way up to the Euphrates River, and it's going to expand all the way to the coast of the Mediterranean. It's going to be a fairly large and powerful kingdom there in the Middle East. And then, of course, why does it not last? It splits into two, right? And eventually it's going to be conquered. The northern kingdom is going to be conquered by the Hittites, and the southern kingdom is going to be conquered by the Babylonians. They need to make sense out of all this stuff, right? And the historical record among these Israelites seems to be fairly full of, you know, detail about all of this. They kept pretty good records all along, right? Yeah. Okay, any other questions about this? Interesting stuff. Go home and read the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. I mean, it really takes
Well, it's such a human story.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's good for us to see that.
Yeah.
When we become very discouraged with ourselves, we realize that God could have miracles without all this.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
wasn't dependent on how we behave.
Human agency, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, there's if you stop and think about before you become too discouraged with David, there's a lot of parallels between Saul and David, because remember, Saul is chosen by God to rule over the Israelites, and yet towards the end of the reign, there's rebellion, and he actually loses the kingdom. And the question is why? And if you will remember last week, she talked about, he usurps the power of Samuel. Remember, he's waiting for Samuel to come and to offer up a sacrifice to God so he can go into battle, and Samuel never comes, and then he does it. And then Samuel shows up and says, "What have you done?" Right? And then he's ordered to go to battle against the Amalekites, and to extinguish them all, to destroy them all, and to have nothing to do with them. And yet he spares some of them, and he takes the plunder home, right?
Yeah.
And so he transgresses against God. Well, David does the same thing, right? David does the same thing. And this is, they're trying to make sense out of then, if these men have been chosen by God to rule over us, why do things end so badly? And as you said, they're only human. They're only human. Yeah.
Well, the thing that was going through my mind when I was reading this many years ago was I could never understand why there was such anger against Saul when I felt that David was much worse than Saul.
Yeah.
I mean, the things that David did, it seemed to me, and I didn't understand all the importance of the things that Saul did, that were so grievous, but she explained that last time.
Mm-hmm.
But I just felt sorry for Saul. I felt that he was a manic depressive and couldn't help what he was doing, and David knew very well what he was doing, and yet he was the one that everybody thought was the greatest.
Yeah.
I had a problem with that.
Yeah. Well, and you know, here's the other thing too, that oftentimes winners write history, and Saul doesn't come out a winner, and it's the descendants of David who continue to rule in the south, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they can in fact burnish David's image to a certain extent. And whereas poor Saul, he has no heirs, and so
No.
he's just at the mercy of the people who are writing the history as well. Yeah. Okay, so
Who
next
said the
week.
Bible is dull?
Yeah. Next week, we're going to have, there's going to be a class, my colleague, Rick Rogers from Eastern Michigan University is going to come in and talk about some good reads, if you want some good historical reads dealing with Christian history, and he's going to spend an entire hour offering you his perspective on a number of good reads that you can spend the summer looking into. So I encourage you to come to class next week, okay? All right, thanks.
Thank you.